On the eve of Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971, a man calmly walked through a crowded terminal at Portland International Airport. The man walked up to the ticket counter of Northwest Orient Airlines and purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle. He identified himself to the ticket agent as Dan Cooper. While the flight was en route, the man quietly gave a written note to a stewardess that he was hijacking the plane, then opened his briefcase showing her a bomb. He then made several demands, including $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. Later, while the plane was in the air, he put on one of the parachutes, strapped the money to himself with the cords from one of the remaining parachutes, then jumped out of the plane's rear staircase, never to be seen again. And what you just heard was just a brief background on the 1971 D.B. Cooper Skyjacking. This is part 2 of a 2-part series. I ended part 1 on talking about the suspects, and the one we ended on in the first one was Robert Rackstraw and the problems he has as being a D.B. Cooper suspect. Number 1 I pointed out was his age. He was only 28 years old at the time, and all the witnesses had D.B. Cooper being around 45 years of age. And Robert Rackstraw, as you can see in the photo I put up, which was just taken a month before the skyjacking, looks about 28 years old. He doesn't look older for his age. I really don't think he was wearing makeup because he sat by Tina Mucklow for so long. I think she would have noticed that. Other problems he had, you'll have to go back to part 1 and watch it, where the biggest piece of evidence that Thomas Colbert, the TV producer, put forward as him being the suspect was 2 letters that they said Rackstraw had written. There were D.B. Cooper letters, and he had embedded codes in them, and I go over that and how they couldn't have both been by the same writer. So there's a lot of things against Rackstraw, and I'm fully confident, such as most people in the D.B. Cooper world, that he was definitely not D.B. Cooper. The next suspect I want to go over is Richard McCoy, and everybody knows that Richard McCoy pulled off a similar skyjacking just a few months after the D.B. Cooper heist, and he was eventually caught for that, but he did get away with it initially. But if you read the details on the Richard McCoy hijacking event, they are completely different than the D.B. Cooper job, and I'll go over some of those. One of them is that it's a fact that when he was waiting to board the plane, it was a 727 as well. He was going to jump out of the aft there. We all know where he got that idea, of course, D.B. Cooper. And he had actually told a friend of his when the D.B. Cooper skyjacking happened that he would have asked for $500,000 instead of $200,000 as D.B. Cooper did. Well, that's exactly what Richard McCoy did. He asked for $500,000 and he got it. So the biggest thing that sticks out to me between the 2 hijackings, as McCoy, when he was waiting to board the 727, actually left his envelope with typewritten instructions for the hijacking in the waiting area. It had 2 pages that his wife had typed up for him, and it had a hand grenade pin and a bullet inside the envelope, and it literally had written on the outside hijack instructions, and he leaves it in the waiting area. I don't know if that was in another envelope or not, and apparently whoever picked it up to bring it back on the plane did not read what the envelope said. But as he took his seat, a passenger agent got on the plane and said, "Someone left this brown envelope back in the waiting area. Does anyone want to claim it?" And of course, McCoy claimed it immediately, probably, just sweating to death, like, how could I have done that? I mean, it all would have been blown out, this whole plan right there. Let's compare that to D.B. Cooper, who was calm, cool, sat on the plane, and when he handed out his instructions to the stewardesses, he actually asked for them back. And not only did he ask for those back, he asked for the handwritten ones that the stewardesses took up to the pilots for his demands. That's just glaring. I mean, this is a real operator versus a complete novice who even got his idea from D.B. Cooper doing it in the first place. These 2 are not the same person. It was not Richard McCoy. One, we know he was too young. He was 29 years old at the time, just like Rackstraw. He wasn't the right age. Another point is physical characteristic, just pointing out the truth. He had large protruding ears, and that was even on the FBI wanted poster when McCoy went to jail for that skyjacking. He managed to break out of jail, eventually died. He was on the run for a while and got killed in a shootout with the police. But when he was out on the lam for a while from jail, they had a FBI poster out, and it puts that in his description: large protruding ears. Not one person that saw D.B. Cooper on that plane said that he had large protruding ears, and that will tie into another suspect as well that had a similar characteristic. So those are just a quick couple of things on Richard McCoy. I know there's a book written about him called The Real McCoy, an FBI agent. Somebody else helped him write it, and they try to convince you that it's Cooper. McCoy was actually a Mormon, and people wondered how a Mormon would have been able to drink one glass of bourbon and smoke cigarettes on there, which is something they definitely don't do. I think they even tried to circulate that they found a BYU tie clip on the plane, which obviously would have pointed towards McCoy, who went to BYU. That was never proven. I think they just floated that out there to make him more believable. But I think even the people that wrote the book probably eventually concluded that Richard McCoy was not D.B. Cooper. And another thing that I read about McCoy was that he was missing the skin that attaches to the bottom of his tongue, that attaches your tongue to the bottom of your mouth. That got cut in an accident at some point, I think in his youth, and he always had a lisp from that. And I think he worked on it over the years, but from what I read, that he's always had some form of a lisp, and no one that was on the Cooper plane ever described D.B. Cooper as having a lisp, especially Tina Mucklow, that talked to him the most, never indicated that he had any form of a lisp. So those are just some things that point heavily against Richard McCoy. There's more, but those are the basic ones. So with that being said, I want to move on to another suspect. So sticking with the large protruding ear theme brings us to the next suspect, which is Dwayne Weber. I don't know how this guy ever got to be a rank and file top 5 D.B. Cooper suspect. It's all based on a story that his wife Jo told about him making a deathbed confession to her right before he died as to being D.B. Cooper. She said at one point she found an airplane ticket from that flight in some tax papers. Of course, she's never been able to produce this ticket since and claims that it's lost. That's very convenient. But she said at some point, I think around right before Brian Ingram found the money on the Tina bar, she said that he took her on a trip up to that area and was close to that area and maybe had a chance to go plant some of the money on the Tina bar up there before Brian Ingram found it. That's all part of her story. And I've personally never been able to find where Dwayne Weber was ever in the military or had any paratrooping experience or skydiving experience for that matter. I think she left that out. But people that are into D.B. Cooper know that Jo Weber was extremely aggressive in pushing her husband as a D.B. Cooper suspect. She was posting on the message boards up to 25 times a day, all hours of the day and night, 4 in the morning. She's responding to people. I think people got to where they would just skip over her posts. They got to be so numerous and off the wall. I mean, I almost think that she must have been some kind of FBI plant to try to throw a wrench into any true suspects for being D.B. Cooper, because she's so aggressive. As Bruce Smith said, she had good chops. I mean, she was able to get in with Tina Mucklow's sister and brother-in-law, and he found where she was at their house talking to them. I mean, she's really over the top. But as you can see, Dwayne has large protruding ears. There's no real evidence behind him other than her story. There's no military background whatsoever. There's just zero really pointing to Dwayne Weber. To me, he looks like somebody else that's pretty famous, and I'll put that picture up right now. Okay, so our next contestant, and who was D.B. Cooper sweepstakes, is going to be none other than Mr. Sheridan Peterson. Now, Mr. Peterson's been a top Cooper suspect for quite some time, and for good reason. He actually makes a good suspect. Number one, because he was a very good skydiver. I mean, beyond that, he was considered a maverick. He was very adept at skydiving, and he was from the area, and a lot of people knew that. So that kind of put him on the map as a early D.B. Cooper suspect. So he was investigated pretty thoroughly twice by the FBI. And another thing that didn't help his cause in denying that he was D.B. Cooper is that he once, in a promotional stunt, jumped out of an airplane wearing a suit and loafers, complete with a 20-pound bag of flour tied around him that was trailing behind him as he had jumped out of the plane. That definitely made people think, okay, here's our guy. He's done this before. But that would be pretty insane to have done the D.B. Cooper high stress as something that he had done once before. And I'll also mention that Sheridan Peterson was also a technical writer at Boeing and was the head of the Boeing Skydiving Club in the 60s. So he definitely would have had knowledge, possibly, that 727 could have been jumped being that he was the head of the Boeing skydiving club with all the other Boeing employees that probably worked on the 727. So it wouldn't have been a far-fetched deal that he would have at least known that could have been done. But a lot of things that point away from Mr. Peterson is, number one, he's always denied it, and he's denied it pretty steadfast in his denials of being D.B. Cooper. And his largest denial is that he wasn't even in the country at the time of the skyjacking. He said he was in Tibet and that he fathered a child while he was over in Tibet, and no one could really place him in the area during the skyjacking. But I don't know if he was ever completely proven that he was overseas either. So a lot of people that think he's still the suspect would just say, well, he lied, of course. But I don't think he did. If you read an article that he did, and I'll put that up on the screen, and it's called "Where Have You Been Hiding, D.B. Cooper?" And it's written, of course, by Mr. Peterson, and it's for a Smoke Jumper magazine. And it talks about him being considered D.B. Cooper or being a D.B. Cooper suspect, and the FBI coming to visit him. I think it was for the second time. And if you read the article, it's really good. It's a great article. I would recommend anybody that has ever thought of Peterson being D.B. Cooper should read that article. It's a really solid denial that he was D.B. Cooper and his thoughts on the case in general. But he does talk about when the FBI came to his door, years and years after the skyjacking, and they wanted to get a DNA sample from him. And he was hesitant at first because he's really big into civil liberties, and he always has been his whole life. He's a real big victims advocate. He's a big civil rights person. And it's something that it's really important to him. So when they wanted to take his DNA sample, he originally thought, that's kind of like a violation of my civil liberties. But he knew if he denied it, they would just accuse him of being D.B. Cooper forever. So he relented, gave him the DNA sample. Of course, it did not match up to anything they have, and I really don't know what they have as far as D.B. Cooper goes. I think they might have the glass that he drank the bourbon out of. I know the cigarettes have been lost. How convenient is that? But anyway, if you read that article, you kind of get a good picture of him. His whole life really is an open book. He ran for the school board. He's a real open guy. He's really the type of person that would never have put a whole plane of people in jeopardy. Even if the bomb was fake, he would not have put them through the psychological trauma of all that. If you read about this guy, he really is a good person and cares about people, and has been fighting for people's rights and civil liberties and his whole life. As a matter of fact, he actually was over in Vietnam, but he wasn't a soldier. He was a refugee coordinator or something like that for the Vietnamese refugees, being displaced by the Vietnam War. So he's got a really long history of doing that. His whole persona does not match up. Yes, he's an excellent skydiver. Out of all the D.B. Cooper suspects, he's the second best skydiver. Or actually, he's the best skydiver, but not the best person at jumping out of an airplane, which is more of a paratrooper, which you know who that is. Far better. This Peterson was very steadfast to the rules. He would have never jumped without a helmet. Even when he did his promotional stunt in the suit, he was wearing a helmet. And he would have never, ever done something as crazy as what D.B. Cooper did. I mean, he as good as a jumper that Peterson was, he would have not have jumped into that kind of weather or anything even close to it. So going back to the article, when he was questioned by the FBI, he was just talking about his thoughts on D.B. Cooper in general after denying, of course, that it was him. And one of the FBI agents asked, well, what's it like to jump out of a 727? And his answer was, I don't know. I've never jumped out of a 727. Well, that's a pretty big statement. If you lie to the FBI, that's a pretty big deal. If Peterson did ever jump out of a 727, especially at Boeing, there was probably be a record of that. And he definitely didn't do it over in Vietnam. He wasn't active in the military in Vietnam. I think he was a Korean War vet. I think he did have some early paratrooping experience that probably turned into his skydiving hobby for him, which he was really adept at, that I mentioned earlier. But he flatly denied he had ever even jumped out of a 727 and delighted the FBI point blank like that. I think you got to go with the fact that he's telling the truth. So those are just a few things against Mr. Peterson. Another thing that people point out is he has piercing blue eyes. We know that Florence Schaffner said that D.B. Cooper had brown eyes. I don't know how true that is or not. I will say that Ted Braden has light-colored blue eyes, but I don't think she really got that good look at Cooper's eyes right before he put on his sunglasses. But those are just a few things. Plus, Peterson, as you can tell in that one photo, it was pretty close to the skyjacking. He was very bald. I think D.B. Cooper was more had a widow's peak. Going back to Florence Schaffner, when she did the Unsolved Mysteries show, she swore up and down that the first composite of Cooper, the one they called the Bing Crosby sketch, looked nothing like the real D.B. Cooper. And she came up with what was called Composite 2, and I'll put that up, where he had more of a defined widow's peak. And a lot of these other suspects didn't match that. They either had a hairline going all the way across, or they were almost completely bald. So there's only a very limited people that could fit into that mold if you go with what Florence Schaffner said. But and I also want to add that Sheridan Peterson did not drink or smoke. And we know that D.B. Cooper ordered 2 bourbons and smoked at least 6 Raleigh filter tip cigarettes. So that's another thing pointing away from Peterson. So, that being said, I just really don't think it was Sheridan Peterson. Obviously, it just wasn't. Uh, he didn't have active jumping experience. Actually, I said earlier he was in the Korean War. He wasn't. He was a World War II vet. He was a Marine in World War II. But it's just anyone that could have jumped out of a 727 like that in 1971 had to have been a Vietnam commando. It's just plain and simple. They're the only people that knew that could have been done, and it was definitely a special forces type thing. This couldn't, it just wasn't somebody that may have jumped a little bit during World War II. It was all of a sudden going to jump out of a jet in 1971. It's just people need to do away with these suspects that could only be proven to have jumped during World War II. They really should. I don't know why. And that brings us to another suspect that fits that bill, and it's the famous Kenny Christensen, who has been a really top D.B. Cooper suspect for some time. I have no idea why, but he is. And let's take a real quick look at Kenny. So with Kenny, a lot of you might remember that he was the main focus of a Brad Meltzer Decoded show. It was a really good show, and it talked about Kenny. And people thought maybe this was an inside job because Kenny did work for Northwest Orient Airlines, the airline that was hijacked by D.B. Cooper. So a lot of that had started making sense. So he did have some of a military background. He was joined to fight in World War II late, and he was training as a paratrooper. Late in the war, he was going to be sent out to the Pacific, but the war ended before that ever happened, so he did have some initial training as a paratrooper in World War II, but it was all just pretty much standard jumping, static line stuff, nothing heavy duty at all. And I think that's the only jumping experience he had. It was said that he did some more recreationally later. I read once where he jumped for money or something like that, but it's never been proven. I can't find any concrete evidence of that. That's the thing with D.B. Cooper stuff. You have to really look hard for sources that where it came from. You should always start with the FBI files. But, Kenny did have some jumping experience. The reason he got put on the radar in the first place was that his brother Lyle, who was a Korean War veteran, came up with the story that when Kenny died before Lyle. Lyle was the older brother, but that on Kenny's deathbed, he said, "Hey, there's something I want to tell you, but I can't." And I think he passed away before he actually confessed to being D.B. Cooper, but according to his brother, that's what he was at least going to tell him. So, his brother reached out to some people and said, "Hey, I think my brother could have been D.B. Cooper. This was his name. He worked for the airline." And later it was determined that they at least thought that right after the skyjacking, he went and bought a house for cash for a pretty significant amount of money. And he never made much money, and he was always complaining about it because the airline was always going on strike. But they pointed to, and especially in the Brad Meltzer show, that here's this house he bought for cash. Suddenly he seems to have all this money. But it was later kind of disproven that he did have a promissory note, at least on the house. He did pay some money down. He helped a friend of his sister buy something. I can't remember what it was, some kind of household item that was fairly expensive, but it did look like he came into some money. And actually, when he died, he seemed to have a pretty decent sized estate for somebody that never made a whole lot as an airline purser. So it did look like he found some extra source of money that people could ever really understand where it came from. But like I said before, I just don't think it was Kenny for a lot of reasons. Kenny just didn't have the skills to jump out of a 727. He may have worked for the airline. Maybe he even knew it could be jumped. He had some jumping experience back in World War II, like I said, but it wouldn't have prepared him to jump out in that kind of weather and in that kind of wilderness. He just wasn't trained for it. Didn't have the background. There's no way. And like I said before, the physical description, a lot of people claim he looks like that sketch. They claim everybody looks like that sketch. I mean, my dad looks like that sketch. I look like my dad. I could say I look like that sketch. It's ridiculous. But Kenny does not look like any of the sketches I've ever seen. He's really bald at the time. He pretty fair complected as well. His ears kind of stick out, kind of a la McCoy and Weber. Just doesn't look like him at all, really. It's just not Kenny. I know his brother pointed out the photo that I've got up now where he's coming in, pretty close to the hijacking, where he's carrying a briefcase and everything, and he's like, "That's got to be DB's briefcase. Looks like him. It's him for sure." But it just wasn't. So that brings me to the next suspect I would definitely want to tackle, and that's Walter Rekha. Now, this guy came to the party late by a friend of his that really believes that his buddy was D.B. Cooper, and his name's Carl Lauren. I think he's a pet sitter in Florida. I think retired. I think he's in his early 80s now, but he wrote a book. I think it's called D.B. Cooper and Me, and it's about his buddy that was a paratrooper claiming that he was D.B. Cooper and had this really wild life as a CIA agent and all these crazy tales. But anybody that's read this book or knows much about it, it's got more holes in it than a mile squared block of Swiss cheese. It's just none of it lines up. This guy looks less like the D.B. Cooper composites than any other one. I mean, James Earl Jones looks more like D.B. Cooper than Walter Rekha does. I mean, he looks like an older version of Biff from Back to the Future. He's got like this crew cut. A little later in life, he always has a mustache. We know that D.B. Cooper didn't have a mustache. I know this guy was definitely had a mustache all the time at this point in his life. I don't know if he was D.B. Cooper, and it claimed that he went back to work right after the hijacking, like 2 days. I guess he showed up without a mustache or maybe a fake one for a while. I don't know, but it's crazy when you read about this guy. I just don't think any of it holds water whatsoever. Most of it is if you listen to these recordings that this Carl Lauren has of him talking to Walter Rekha, and he's trying to explain how he says, "Well, hey, how did you pull it off? What happened on the plane?" And I think he just really provides no detail. I think he said it was Tina Mucklow's idea that he could jump out of the aft stair, like he never heard about it. Which is crazy. It's like he really was going to hijack a 727, was planning to jump out of the regular passenger door right by where the engine was and get sucked through it or something like that. And I know when the guy that wrote the book gets pressed on that, he immediately jumps into something different, such as some of Rekha's exploits in the CIA, undercover, doing all these different things. He knows he can't answer the hard questions about what the technical parts were and how well that D.B. Cooper actually did know that 727. He knew it really well. He even knew it could take off with the stairs down, and that's something many people didn't know. Only the commandos over in Vietnam knew that, and the pilots didn't even know that at the time, that the plane could take off with the aft stair down. And there was an argument actually with D.B. Cooper and the pilots about it. But D.B. Cooper finally relented when the pilots just flat out said, "We're not doing it," because they fully believed it couldn't be done. And Cooper knew it could be because the commandos of Vietnam did. But anyway, that's my rant for Walter Rekha. I think one of the funnier things is when he did all the artwork for the book, they used the famous first D.B. Cooper sketch, the one they called the Bing Crosby sketch, and made his nose wider, because obviously Walter Rekha had a fairly wide nose, and that's definitely nothing that anyone sitting on that plane ever recalled about D.B. Cooper. But I think it's kind of funny when you look at that sketch, how they tried to make it look more like him. It's actually kind of comical. Moving on to who I think is probably the second best D.B. Cooper suspect is the one of William Wolfgang Gossett. Obviously, he started out life, his name is William, and at some point he changed it to Wolfgang, but a really interesting guy. He was really put up the ladder as a D.B. Cooper suspect by a lawyer named Galen Cook that was doing a lot of the shows like Coast to Coast, talking about the whole D.B. Cooper case. Galen's a real smart guy. And he was actually listening to Coast one night, and one of Gossett's son had called into the show and saying, "Hey, I think my dad was D.B. Cooper." Of course, that puts him about one of about 20,000 people that think their dad was D.B. Cooper. But there's something that rang true to Galen hearing this guy. I think his name was Greg Gossett, and he talked about one time that William Gossett took his two sons up to Canada and showed them a safety deposit box, and they thought that's where he could have hidden the money. Gossett was a pretty decorated. I think he was an Army veteran. World War II. I think he did some in Korea. He was over in Vietnam as well, but he did not see any action in Vietnam. I think he was an Army law consultant or something like that. He had a desk job in Vietnam, but was not an active jumper in Vietnam whatsoever. But he did have extensive survival training. So in a lot of ways, he could have fit the bill. One thing that, actually, when I started getting really into D.B. Cooper, Gossett was my suspect as well. I listened to Galen. It made a lot of sense. I knew that college student Bill Mitchell that was on the plane said the one thing he remembered sitting right across from D.B. Cooper was that he had a sagging chin or a turkey neck. And William Gossett had that, especially, even when he was younger, he just had that extra skin under his neck. And I thought, man, that's got to be it, because William Mitchell thought that because he saw Tina Mucklow sitting by him so much, and he thought she was just being flirtatious with him, and Bill Mitchell being a college guy thinking, why does this kind of cute flight attendant paying this guy so much attention? Obviously he didn't know the plane was being hijacked, but one thing he noticed about him, he's this older looking guy. He's got this flabby chin. Why? He's old. I'm a young guy. Why isn't she talking to me? It's one of those things you would just remember, and that's one of the great thing that came out of any eyewitness description is that, and I believe it just because that's just so sincere of Bill Mitchell to mention that and why he remembered it. But Gossett had that, and he had some decent Army training. He was a paratrooper, not active in Vietnam, but probably possibly could have done the jump. He had his sons come forward and say that if they think it was him, and it definitely made a good suspect. I think Galen tried to show where some of the D.B. Cooper letters came from different places that Gossett had lived, and where they could have been mailed from. But if you watch my first video, you'll see that the first 5 letters, at least according to me, were not the real Dan Cooper. They were wannabes claiming to be D.B. Cooper. I don't think the first 5 letters were by the Skyjacker at all. I think only the 6th letter was, and that was the final letter. It's the only one, I think, but you'd have to go back and watch the first video to understand that. But anyway, I think Gossett's a good suspect. I don't think it's him. I for a lot of reasons. I just don't think it was his personality to do it. I think he was a gambler. He definitely would have wanted money, but just don't think he was just quite in shape to make that jump like some of the Vietnam commandos would have been. And Galen Cook kind of dropped out of sight. He was going to be writing a book on Gossett, and he never did. I think that's kind of suspicious. I think maybe he found out a few things that pointed him, away from being D.B. Cooper. I know there was maybe a couple descriptions of D.B. Cooper's voice, and they described it as low. Definitely no discernible accent, but a low voice. There's actually a video on YouTube of William Gossett. Actually, he was going by Wolfgang at that point. He changed his name from William to Wolfgang, which was strange. But there's a video on YouTube of him on doing a ghost hunt. And actually, Clyde Lewis with Ground Zero knew Gossett pretty well, and kind of got Clyde back into the whole D.B. Cooper thing because he knew one of the top suspects being Gossett. I think from Salt Lake, and no, actually, I think he was somewhere else in Utah, maybe. I can't recall where, but where he was living, but they knew each other pretty well. But there is a video of Gossett on there, and if you hear his voice, it's definitely not what I would consider low. And, some of the, going back to the Widow's Peak and Florence Schaffner, he doesn't really fit that mold. But other than that, he's probably, I would say, the second best suspect over. Go back and watch my first video. You'll know who the top one is. But Gossett, good suspect, but not D.B. Cooper. So last but not least would bring me to a guy named James Klansnick. Now, I don't know a whole lot about this guy, but there's definitely some people out there who are pushing him hard as a big top D.B. Cooper suspect. I know that he worked at Boeing. He was, I think he was an engineer at Boeing, probably would have been very familiar with the 727 and what it could do being jumped and whatnot. Klansnick was a World War II veteran with some paratrooping experience. I think he ejected out of his plane somewhere over Austria during World War II, and he wrote somewhere that was going to be the last time he ever came out of a plane, jumped out of a plane, ejected out of a plane, and from what I could find, he pretty much stuck to that. There is absolutely no record of this guy ever parachuting, skydiving, paratrooping, whatever you want to call it, out of a plane ever since. I think he stuck to that promise. So how he became such a D.B. Cooper suspect at all is kind of baffling to me. But I guess just based on the fact that he worked at Boeing was enough, and maybe that he was a Caucasian male and had somewhat darker hair. I think those were all his qualifications to be D.B. Cooper. And sorry, that's not good enough. It's just not going to work. And if he was a Boeing engineer, one thing's for sure: when D.B. Cooper was on the plane, the only time he got really excited and upset was when it was taking too long to refuel the plane, and he kept saying, "Why is this taking so long? Why is this taking so long?" He was definitely wanting to get the show on the road. I think Clanton would have known exactly how long it would take to refuel a 727. Yet Cooper was getting really antsy. Also, from all appearances, this Clanton guy was a real family man. I don't think D.B. Cooper was. I mean, they weren't looking for D.B. Cooper on Thanksgiving dinner. I think no one could have had a clue where the guy was, but Clanton, they probably knew where he was for Thanksgiving dinner, and he was probably home with his family. Not a family guy. No record of him jumping since he ejected out of the plane in World War II. I can't see it with him. It's not him. Sorry. So that concludes my first line of suspects. I think there might be a few more out there I didn't touch on, so there's always a possibility of a next video. Please subscribe, and please like if you liked what you saw. Thanks. And for further listening pleasure, please go check out a podcast called The Cooper Vortex by host Darren Schaefer and audio engineer Russell Colbert. Greatest thing going on D.B. Cooper. You can find out about all the suspects I talked about on there. There's shows on every one of them, and probably some you've never even heard of and some that no one's ever heard of, but they're all great. So definitely go check out that podcast.